Adolf Hitler began Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941. This marked the start of a campaign that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Second World War. At first, the Germans experienced incredible success as the panzers advanced, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers in massive encirclement battles. However, the Soviet Union did not collapse as anticipated, and despite the terrible losses, their will to fight persisted. German casualties increased as they came agonizingly close to capturing Moscow, only 20 miles from their goal. The Soviets launched a surprise counterattack, forcing the Germans to go on the defensive. A reminder to subscribe to the Imperial War Museum's YouTube channel for more movies before we address the question of how Hitler's first loss on land in the Second World War occurred, and why Operation Barbarossa came so close to victory before failing at the last hurdle. Even in Mein Kampf in the mid-1920s, Adolf Hitler was preparing to attack the Soviet Union every 2 weeks. This would be the battlefield where the ideology of National Socialism would either prevail or fail. Hitler started planning the invasion of the Soviet Union as early as July 1940, before the Battle of Britain actually occurred. Among the principles of such philosophy was the notion of Lebensworld, or dwelling area. The establishment of an Eastern European Germanic Aryan kingdom that would provide the necessary resources to become self-sufficient. Germany was certain that it could take such territory from the Soviet Union after defeating France and the Low Countries in just 6 weeks. The Germans are not only planning a fast blitzkrieg campaign that will force the Soviet Union to withdraw from the war in 6 to 8 weeks, but they also need a quick victory because they cannot have a slow attritional war. Hitler believed that communist society was fundamentally weak and that it would not take much to defeat it. His famous quote is, "All we have to do is kick the door in and the whole edifice will come crumbling down." We must win fast in order to accomplish that victory, since there are not enough manpower and material reserves to build a long wall. More than 3 million men were gathered by Germany. 3 army groups from the biggest invasion force in combat history set out for 3 distinct targets. The entire strategy is a continuation of the blitzkrieg concept, which has been so successful in France and states that you win by not fighting. If you would like to learn more about blitzkrieg and how it works, I have included a link to our video on the topic in the description. Army Group North is heading for Leningrad, Army Group Center is aiming for Moscow, and Armor Group South is heading for Kiev. On June 22, 1941, those strategies were effective. The progress surpasses all expectations. As German tanks blasted past the Soviet fortifications, hundreds of thousands of troops were taken. The Germans started the war by essentially defeating the Soviet Air Force on the ground, surprising them. The German army is able to maneuver freely across the battlefield, pushing deep into the Russian interior and encircling the frontier armies since the Soviet Air Force is essentially destroyed. In contrast to the French and British armies in the Battle of France, Stalin's purges of the Soviet officer corps left his army badly commanded, and the Soviet army was caught completely off guard and had not had time to reinforce their new border in Poland. The Germans expected to have destroyed the Russian field armies by the time they reached this point, and the remaining advance towards Moscow would have been more of a parade than a battle. However, the Germans had completely underestimated the size of the Soviet army. They were going to invade with about 3 million men, and they expected the total Soviet army to be roughly the same. The Soviet armies are so slow and badly led that they do not have time to pull back. They are encircled completely and cut off hundreds of thousands of men. Hitler said, "Well, hold on a minute." Despite protests from the German generals, the Army Group Center stopped its attack on Moscow and peeled off to the left and right to help destroy the Soviet pockets that were still fighting, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers in massive battles of annihilation. These large encirclements behind the German lines became a real problem because they could now attack into the German lines of communication and cut them off from the front line. Finished, and the drive on Moscow could start. This pause to look behind and clear up behind to allow everyone to catch up gives the Soviets a chance to redraw their own front line and bring more units into the front line, dig in before Moscow. This means that when the Germans resume the offensive, they will not have to break through a completely new defense line. However, this was not the only issue for Germany. New supplies were starting to arrive from Britain, and many of these divisions did not have uniforms. Instead, they were dressed in civilian clothes. Additionally, some of these divisions had to share rifles because there were not enough rifles to go around. Finished, and the drive on Moscow could start. This pause to look behind and clear up behind to allow everyone to catch up gives the Soviets a chance to redraw their own front line and bring more units into the front line, dig in before Moscow. This means that when the Germans resume the offensive, they will not have to break through a completely new defense line. However, this was not the only issue for Germany. New supplies were starting to arrive from Britain, and many of these divisions did not have uniforms. Instead, they were dressed in civilian clothes. Additionally, some of these divisions had to share rifles because there were not enough rifles to go around, both because they are encountering a new defensive line that they were not prepared for. The Soviet weather is interfering, and the majority of German formations, particularly the armored formations at the spear's tip, are now reduced to roughly 50 men. By the time they reach 20 kilometers from Moscow, the weather has completely changed and is now full-blown. By the end of November, there are more German soldiers in hospitals suffering from frostbite than there are with gunshot wounds due to the Soviet cold. Even though the onslaught was over, Germany still appeared to be in a strong position when the Barbarossa came to a halt. North Army Group was certain that the beleaguered Leningrad was on the verge of collapse, and Army Group Center was at the gates of Moscow. An Army Group South had captured Ukraine and Kiev, and when the new year arrived, they intended to complete the task. However, they were unaware that the Soviets had a secret weapon. They had transferred most of the Russian divisions on the eastern side of the Soviet Union that had been fighting the Japanese and Mongolia because they had discovered that the Japanese would not attack. These were not green, inexperienced troops. Rather, they were legitimate Soviet field divisions, and many of them had received winter combat training because they were from Siberia, unlike the weary Germans they would be up against. Hitler's ideological belief that the Soviet society would collapse when they kicked the door in could not have been further from the truth. The Germans needed a swift victory, but the Soviets had managed to stay in the fight and turn the blitzkrieg Barbarossa into a war of production. The Germans are now being forced into a war of attrition, a long, grinding, slow war in the Soviet interior, in this case in winter,